I'm Alex Worth. I'm here in partnership with Native Fish Society, and I'll be presenting my capstone project, the presentation for which is titled Fish Hatcheries, Recreation, and Rewilding in Oregon, Public Perspectives from a Statewide Survey. So brief introduction to the agenda. My presentation is going to be formatted somewhat differently than other ones that you might have seen today. It's going to be a little bit shorter than most others. At the request of my partner organization, I'm not going to divulge or discuss some of my deliverables or recommendations. I won't be discussing their future actions, their strategies, and some of the work that I've been doing with them for the last 2 months of my project. But that being said, the agenda for the presentation, we're going to start with an introduction to salmon, to wild fish advocacy, and the social ecological system. We'll introduce my partner organization, Native Fish Society, and talk about their role in the system. We'll go over the survey development, administration, and key results from the study. We'll talk about some conclusions from that, future opportunities, applications, and recommendations, some limitations of the study, personal reflections, and then a period for Q&A at the end. So, salmon, for those who aren't aware of their life history cycles, they are born in freshwater, where they rear to a stage referred to as a smolt, after which they migrate out into the ocean. They out-migrate from those rearing waters, and they go different directions once they reach the ocean. You can see on that lower map, that's a map of the migration patterns for Columbia Basin and Snake River Basin salmon. You can see that fall Chinook and some coho species will go out into the ocean. They just kind of hang around right outside the mouth of the river. Steelhead will move rapidly offshore, migrate all the way across the Pacific Ocean to the Sea of Japan, Sea of Okhotsk. And then spring Chinook, chum salmon, sockeye salmon, and some coho salmon will take a right-hand turn as soon as they get to the ocean, and they will migrate up the shelf to the Gulf of Alaska. In saltwater, once these fish reach maturity, they will migrate back to their rivers where they spawned in to complete this life cycle. Sometimes they'll migrate 900 or more miles up and down river. And sometimes, like steelhead, for example, will migrate 7,000 or 8,000 miles in the ocean. All salmon and some steelhead will die after they spawn. And this is critical for recycling marine nutrients, most importantly, marine-derived nitrogen, back into the system. Some notes here about historical abundance and health of salmon. So this is the only interactive part of the presentation. Maybe not for those of you who are online, but I'm curious here. Do we have any guesses what ocean abundance is like for salmon now versus historic numbers? Do you have any guesses?
Numbers?
Danny?
Yeah, like a percentage?
Sure.
Like 20% of original.
20% of historic.
5%.
5%.
I was gonna say like 2 or 3.
2 or 3.
I was gonna say
That's a good range. This is always something that surprises people. Right now, there are 2.6 times the number of salmon in the Pacific Ocean than there were before colonial involvement. So there is a disproportionate number of pink and chum salmon, and a high percentage of those are hatchery origin, not wild fish. Despite this high abundance of salmon in the Pacific, fish returns to the lower 48 states are very low relative. Some estimates point to 16 to 30% of distinct populations of salmon are now completely extinct. And there is a 90% drop in the number of wild salmon returns to the Pacific Northwest relative to pre-colonial estimates. There are some serious implications of this high oceanic abundance, namely poor fisheries for Chinook and coho. And I have written in my notes here, yet unknown trophic effects in the North Pacific. However, while I was hanging out this afternoon waiting to present, apparently a paper was published several days ago by the same author who's been studying this oceanic abundance, explaining all the predicted trophic effects in the North Pacific. I will give you the spoilers, they're not good. Any management decisions are extremely contentious because of this resource scarcity in the lower 48, and that's particularly the case with Chinook salmon, coho salmon, and with steelhead. In terms of management and conservation as well, in the state of Oregon, it's largely Fish and Wildlife that's managing the system. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has two major missions: to protect and conserve native fish and to provide angling opportunities to residents. And normally this isn't an issue, but because of the scarcity of the resource and the fact that it's really a zero-sum game at this point, if you give to one of those major missions, it's going to take away from the others. So it's conflicting. If you protect and conserve native fish, you're going to inherently take angling opportunities away from residents. If you give more angling opportunities to residents, you're going to be inherently taking away that protection and conservation of native fish. In the ocean, it's managed by the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is more commonly known as NOAA Fish. They manage marine fish and habitat and harvest, and it's the managing governing federal body for oceanic salmon. They don't have that same duality in missions. They're largely focused on conservation and preservation and managing the population in a healthy way. Conservation orgs definitely are taking a harder stance on these threats. They take action, as nonprofits generally do, with far more mobility and flexibility than the government agencies do. And different wild fish advocacy groups, which is those conservation groups that focus on salmon, fill slightly different niches in advocacy. I've listed a few of them up here, given their logos. Trout Unlimited and Wild Salmon Center, for example, they look to operate on a wider range of scopes than the smaller ones, and they have more of a focus on science and policy, while Native Fish Society, Wild Fish Conservancy, and the Conservation Angler fill some similar roles in terms of ideology, driving more of like a hard stance. And they also act similarly in terms of legal and grassroots actions. On to the major threats facing salmon. There are a ton of them, and I'm going to kind of stick to the really core ones here. The first one is lost habitat, and that's largely due to deforestation, to water rights drawing down river levels. More river means more habitat for salmon, but most importantly is definitely hydropower. Hydropower dams are just really prevalent in the Pacific Northwest, and they block passage for fish to get up to the upper reaches of watersheds where they generally spawn. And despite really effective advancements in fish passage, it's still an impediment to their migration, and it prevents them from having as effective of a spawning journey. Next is overharvest, which is much more strictly managed now, but salmon harvest was virtually unregulated through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and we're seeing the legacy effects of that still to this day. Climate change is also a huge issue for all conservation issues, but particularly for salmon. It has freshwater and saltwater impacts. Salmon are cold water fish, meaning as soon as water reaches a certain level of heat, they're not able to maintain their health any longer, and they just die. In freshwater, you see drought cycles increasing, you see hotter water, lower oxygen content, and lots of eutrophication and problematic algae, toxic algae blooms. In saltwater, changing ocean currents that are unpredictable, as well as you can see there on that NASA oceanic map, the warm water blob in the middle of the Pacific makes it very difficult for steelhead to migrate to their destination in Sea of Okhotsk and Sea of Japan. Lastly here, and this is going to be the focus for the rest of the presentation, focus for my study, is problematic genetic material. First of these two is fish farms, which also pollute, have very high rates of parasite and disease transfer. And any escaping fish that spawn with wild fish are going to be problematic because these fish they're not being selected. There's no natural selection when they're in a giant fish pen and they're fed pellets. And if they spawn with wild fish, then they're going to decrease the genetic integrity of that wild fish. The last thing here is hatcheries, which we're about to deep dive into. First, what's a fish hatchery? It's a controlled propagation and rearing facility where salmon eggs are fertilized. Then the offspring are reared in a controlled environment before being released into a nearby stream once they have reached juvenile or smolt stage. Problematic hatchery programs take competition and natural selection processes out of the equation during multiple stages of development, and they leave fish in the system that may end up diluting the genetic integrity of well-adapted wild fish. The hatcheries that we're considering here are not the ones that are used for reintroduction to rivers with extinct populations, but for populations that are already existent. They're used for bolstering abundance for many reasons. Fish hatcheries initially were used broadly as a management strategy to mitigate lost abundance due to anthropogenic impacts, namely hydropower dams. They're also now more commonly used to bolster abundance to benefit sport and commercial fishing ventures. So it was really just the late 1980s, early 1990s that this started being studied. One of the most famous papers was titled "The Road to Extinction is Paved with Good Intentions." Fish hatcheries have really been the subject of scrutiny in fisheries literature for decades now. A recent review paper authored by John McMillan and an international team, the results are going to be on the graph on the bottom image, it found that just 3% of fish hatcheries around the world have a beneficial effect on the population they're managing. 70% of fish hatcheries have an adverse impact, and 13% have at least a minimally adverse impact on the population they're meant to manage. That's not really a great look. Having that little of a fraction of the programs actually having a beneficial impact and having that frequency where they're having a negative impact, it's definitely something that needs consideration. There are some literature sources that suggest a lack of negative impacts and stress the opportunities for further use of hatcheries as a conservation and management tool. And they really stress the importance of reducing the proportion of hatchery origin fish that are spawning with wild origin fish, which in a river, you can imagine that that's very, very difficult to manage and to prevent from happening. They also stress the importance of improving competitive success through selection of hatchery spawned and reared fish. They prioritize increasing opportunities for selection processes to occur in those hatcheries during the development of those fish before they're released into the wild. Despite this really overwhelming body of literature showing the negative impacts of fish hatcheries, most people think they're good. And as an avid angler myself, I've had many interactions with people who are anglers and non-anglers alike, who have very strong positive attitudes and positive perceptions about fish hatcheries. And that's clear that there's not much awareness regarding fish hatchery impacts, and clearly some misinformation out there as well. So brief introduction here to some of the stakeholders that are important in the system. We have passionate public members. Before coming to grad school, I'd kind of count myself as one of those. Those are anglers, like people who fish, fishing guides, guide and angler organizations like the Oregon Anglers Alliance, Trout Unlimited chapters, or organizations like the Steamboaters. They're generally the people who are most in touch with the rivers. They're the ones who are recreating on it. They're the ones who make their living on it. They're the first people to speak up when contentious management decisions are made. And they're the loudest generally, and the ones who kind of sink their teeth in the most to the issue. And those people are generally backed up by nonprofit organizations like wild fish advocacy groups and organizations like Wild Hatchery Coexist. That's an organization that backs up people who are advocating for more use of fish hatcheries to manage the system, to bolster abundance and increase angling opportunities. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is definitely a key stakeholder here. They manage all state-run fish hatcheries in the state of Oregon. There are some other fish hatcheries that are federally managed or that are tribal federally co-managed, which is an important opportunity for us to introduce tribes, because fish hatcheries are really a critical part of them sustaining their cultural practices. And in Oregon, some tribes do have the privilege of having autonomy over their own hatchery operations and some autonomy over management of the system, but some tribes have absolutely none. It's really a mess. It's complicated and it's certainly inequitable. State and federal agencies are involved at many different levels of management: Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, Oregon Water Resources Department, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USGS, NOAA Fish, and many more. They're all at least loosely involved in managing the system, because any decision about water use, timber and forestry, managing flow regimes, water rights, and water quality, they all have an impact on salmon. So any management decision that impacts those is going to impact salmon and vice versa. So there's some mutualism, some complexity there. Definitely the timber industry is going to be a part of this, because in the state of Oregon, it's the biggest industry. It has been for centuries, and it will probably be for centuries to come. There's a kind of a saying that timber is king in the state of Oregon. They always have a lobbyist in every room. They're always involved in every decision. Power authorities are definitely going to be a vested interest in salmon management because of their need to mitigate habitat loss from hydropower dams. Hatcheries have been the easiest and status quo solution to that. It's much harder to engineer state-of-the-art fish passage or do other methods like trap and haul. Lastly, the commercial fishing industry, they have clear investment here because more abundance means more profits for them. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of depth on this, but this is a stakeholder matrix. I did like a stakeholder inventory activity at the Native Fish Society annual gathering in May. This is an aggregate of the different groups, placements of different stakeholders in the matrix. Not like the movie, but no, seriously. I added my own opinions in here and really just focused on key stakeholders and took some other ones out. But the graph goes low to high interest, low to high influence. And I think it's just really important to note that when I took all the key stakeholders and placed them on this map, there is none in the lower left. There's a lot of people who really have a lot of influence, a lot of play, and a lot of people who are very passionate about it. It's a zero-sum game, so that's kind of an intuitive result, but lots of people care, and that means that the management decisions are always going to be a battle. So now we'll introduce my partner org. I'm going to refer to them as NFS instead of their full name. They were founded by longtime wild fish advocate Bill Bakke in 1995. They're involved all over the Pacific Northwest, including California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. Their mission statement is guided by the best available science. Native Fish Society advocates for the protection and recovery of wild native fish and the stewardship of the habitats that sustain us all. They have 5 targets with their action, which are nice. They're alliterative: heat, harvest, hydropower, habitat, and hatcheries. And their 2 primary focuses of work are on hatchery and harvest reform. Outside of their staff initiatives towards those 5 H's, NFS largely relies on a stewardship model where they have people who are river stewards who are advocates for their local watersheds. They have regional coordinators that are staffed to facilitate those stewards, and they rely a lot on grassroots organizing and advocacy from the public. But they also have a strong history of litigation and contentious management decisions. So initial conversations with NFS, we really found that our goals align with the primary hatchery focus. And the goals for the project were to learn more about how Oregonians perceive fish hatcheries, how they perceive wild and hatchery origin fish, and how Oregonians perceive their own level of knowledge and awareness on fish hatcheries, and then to compare the findings of those objectives with other variables associated with their fishing habits and perceptions. So a brief overview of the methodology that I used for this study. Objectives, again, were to understand hatchery perceptions, to measure and understand self-perceived informity on fish hatcheries and hatchery fish, to look at outdoor recreation. We looked at angling frequency, target fish species, their behavior on catch and release versus harvest, and some other outdoor recreation habits as well. We also looked at their philosophical perception of wild versus hatchery fish. In terms of methods, I got really excited about participatory methods after we learned about it spring semester, and I got really interested and passionate about the idea of using a participatory scenario planning method to see what anglers would value most in setting up like a rough management plan for a fishery. But that is just way too inconvenient for the timeline and scope of the project that Native Fish Society wanted. And a survey was far more practical for their needs and for the spatial and temporal scope of the project. So we settled on a survey. Some notes on the administration of the survey here. For sampling, we stratified for age and gender, proportional to US Census data about the state of Oregon. We're operating on a bare bones budget, minimal budget. So we opted not to stratify by location, which we will get into why that might have been a problem shortly. We had a 400-person minimum sample size. It was a sample of the entire state, and we had representation from each county in the state. And for sampling, we went through a Qualtrics sampling firm. The survey was administered on Qualtrics, like the module, and then it was distributed by the sampling firm. We paid them for distributing the survey, for the support of a project manager, and the participants who took the survey were paid for their time. In terms of administration of the survey, again, it was all online. We opted to not do mail-in because of the expense and inconvenience and timeline. And we collected 415 samples in just 5 days. So we're going to start off here going over some key figures on the survey population. There was some surprising findings and some potential skewing and bias in the sample. The first really surprising one here was that we asked people, do you participate in any form of fishing? We didn't restrict that to any like timeline or anything like that. But the surprising finding is that 57.6% of people said yes, they do participate in any form of fishing. And we compared that to a 2019 survey that ODFW did, where they found 20% of Oregonian fishing license holders participated in angling, which is a small part of the state of Oregon. So that's a little bit fishy, pardon the pun. But we saw 57.6% of people say they did participate in any form of fishing, but we didn't worry too much about this. We attributed it to the vagueness of the language. And it could be that somebody participated in fishing a lot in their 20s, but now they're 80 years old and they don't do it anymore. So we weren't super concerned. It was a little surprising though. This was definitely surprising. We asked people about their catch and release versus harvest habits. And we were kind of thinking this would be the opposite result. 63.6% of participants who engaged in angling behavior said they practice catch and release predominantly. That was definitely surprising to us. We figured it would be the opposite, if not skewed even further in the opposite direction. And definitely something to consider going forwards with maybe future iterations of the survey. This is definitely the first indicator of some sample bias that we saw, where we asked people, about their ethnicity. We saw 74.9% of people identified as white or Caucasian, 5.5% identified as Hispanic or Latinx, and 15.4% of people identified as Black or African American. The census data would tell us that that was quite biased. The state census data indicated that in the last census round, 85% of Oregonians identified as white, 14.4% identified as Hispanic or Latinx, and 2.3% identified as Black. This is a distribution of participants' ages. We saw it was pretty fairly evenly distributed. We opted to sample proportionally above and below the age of 50. There's a little bit of skewing bias towards 60 to 75, but we didn't think it was all that problematic. Now getting into the good stuff. So this is the first question we asked about hatchery perceptions. We asked them scaling questions, Likert scale questions, from 1 to 5. How much do you strongly disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree or strongly agree on a few prompts? And this one just asked them how hatcheries are important to Oregonians, how much you agree or disagree to that. And only 9% of participants disagreed with that statement. This is really right out of the gates that kind of spoke to our first objective on how people viewed hatcheries. To get a really good idea of how the participants or how they perceive fish hatcheries, we compiled the results of 6 different prompts about hatcheries, some of them phrased in the positive, some of them phrased in the negative, into a single composite mean statistic, which was a more reliable way of looking at their perceptions, and we used that for comparisons. This is one of those comparisons where we look to compare the composite mean of hatchery perceptions for anglers on the top and non-anglers on the bottom. And while you can see there are definitely some stronger attitudes, the scale goes from 1 being strongly disagree with fish hatcheries or low perception to 5 strong positive perception. You can see there's some stronger perceptions on the top graph, but the average was almost identical. And this was really surprising to us. We had a few different hypotheses about this that we figured there would be some differences between anglers and non-anglers, and there really wasn't. I think the next thing to do with this data is to compare to angling frequency, but unfortunately the sample size for avid anglers was far too low for comparison. We'd only be dealing with like 1 to 4 responses for people who are fishing quite frequently, and that's not enough to do reliable comparatives. Next, we had some data that was more qualitative. There was an open-ended question at the end of the survey that prompted participants to please provide any additional comments that you may have about fish hatcheries, native flora and fauna, and your outdoor recreation experience. And after filtering out a tremendous number of frankly quite entertaining junk responses, we retained 66 responses, and I coded that for major themes. The major themes that showed up were hatcheries are important, that hatcheries are valuable for conservation, and then just like basically that people had strong motivations to fish. This is a table with those themes, the frequency at which they showed up, and then some sample texts. So an example of the hatcheries are important theme was I think hatcheries are a great positive for everyone. For hatcheries are valuable for conservation. This was really interesting because people wrote the most about this. They clearly were really passionate about this, and it was the most prevalent theme that showed up. I believe that hatcheries are important to the ecosystem, not to mention it helps with keeping them off the endangered species list or extinct. And as we discussed earlier, only 3% of fish hatcheries around the world are having a positive impact. So there is an obvious huge discrepancy here in terms of people's level of education and awareness on fish hatchery impacts and what they perceive fish hatcheries to do. And the last one, this one's just kind of sweet, fishing motivations. This guy likes catching fish. Or this person, that's catching fish. This is just a great way to look at the qualitative data from a like 30,000 foot perspective. It's a word cloud display. This one really doesn't beat around the bush. You can see pretty clearly what people think about fish hatcheries. Love hatcheries, important. Does not really send any mixed messages there. But you can also look into it and see endangered, preserve, environment, outdoors, good, great hatchery species. And it kind of gets into those sub themes, you know, the hatcheries are valuable for conservation. This is the last result we'll talk about. And this is the one that's really had been the subject of most discussion with myself and my partner organization. This is the 5-point scale simplified into a 3-point scale with strongly disagree and disagree compiled into one, strongly agree and agree compiled into one. And this prompted the participants on whether or not they thought hatchery origin fish and wild origin fish are the same. And only 35% of people disagreed with that statement, which meant to us that not many people really see them as a different entity. And this is something that at first glance wasn't really valuable or important. But you know, if people are really to change, if they're going to truly change the way that they think about hatcheries and hatchery fish in the future, they must perceive a philosophical difference between a fish that's raised in a concrete tank and a fish that's raised in the wild with multiple generations, millions of years of adaptation and selection to that watershed. I know this is an abrupt transition, and it should be talking a little bit about, you know, results, how they're going to apply to strategies. But as I mentioned at the introduction, I'm not going to be discussing those. So the conclusions here: Oregonians overwhelmingly support fish hatcheries. We also have seen out of this survey data that there are certainly a lot of misconceptions and a lack of awareness and understanding regarding their ecological impacts and purpose. And there is certainly like a philosophical divide on hatchery versus wild fish that a lot of people aren't really perceiving or they're not aware of. For recommendations, kind of a weird slide here because I'm not going to really talk about any recommendations that I made to my partner organization, but I can say that I did make a technical report and executive summary about all the findings of the survey, presented it to my partner organization's executive director and board of directors, and had some collaborations with them as well. The recommendations here are more from myself to myself. There's some future research that I would really like to pursue. We need more data on this survey for sure to do more comparatives, especially more representative data. I need to understand perceptions with a finer filter. I did some cluster analyses that weren't really particularly informative. And I think increasing the sample size and maybe the diversity of questions that I'm asking could help find something in the data that I couldn't find before. It's going to be really important in future iterations to stratify the sample for county populations and increase the sample size. I'd also like to have some additional and some altered questions. After some discussions with Oregon State's HDNR department, I'll get into that later, I would like to add, how do you think salmon are doing? Either as an open-ended qualitative question or figure out a way to prompt it in a more quantitative way. And then also follow that up with in your area and overall. I think it's also important to ask them how far they're generally traveling for their normal fishing trip to see whether their fishing experience is part of their immediate local community or if it's something they're invested in that's farther away. There's another question in the survey that asked about how native flora and fauna impacted their outdoor recreation experience and their well-being. And I think it's important for the purposes of this study to parse that out and ask more specifically about fish. Oregonians love their forests. They could be answering that question with a strong attitude, strong response, because they love the state tree, the Douglas fir, and it has nothing to do with fish. So it's important to parse that out. There were quite a few limitations in this study. We had a lot of over and underrepresented groups, which likely had some impact on the results. We saw earlier there's a little skewing in the age and a lot of skewing in the ethnicity. I think it's going to be important to get representative responses by county to ensure a more accurate sample, and that should in theory help to normalize the sample to more accurate statewide numbers. Budget and time were big constraints, even though I thought at the beginning, I'm like, I'm getting a lot of money for this survey. As it turns out, the budget that we had did not go a long ways, and it was the bare minimum budget allowed by Qualtrics sampling firm. The length of the survey was definitely affected by the budget and time. It needed to be short because of budget constraints. The longer the survey, the more they paid participants and the less responses you get. It didn't allow us to sample by county because the more stratifying constraints you put on the survey, the fewer responses that you get. It was all online sampling as well, and arguably mailing or mail-in surveys would give you a different subset of the population that's not necessarily comfortable with online. And in theory, you can overcome that with a really large sample size and good stratification. But again, earlier I mentioned that we didn't have the budget for that. And the last one here that's really key is something I actually thought of fairly recently, no budget for a Spanish translation. And that's so key. We saw that only 2.4% of the people that were surveyed identified as Hispanic or Latinx, and that is not reflective of the 14% of people that identify as Hispanic in the state of Oregon. The last one here, we had a pretty good workaround for this, but introducing a catch question to ensure response quality. A catch question is a question that ensures participants are taking the survey with intention and that they're properly reading prompts. An example would be like, for this question, select the third answer. And if they select the third answer, it validates the survey. But for any other response, it's key that they're not actually reading it and taking care to respond carefully. So it would invalidate the rest of their response. That being said, my brilliant Qualtrics project manager, Roshan, had a great solution to this. He was noticing during our soft launch that some people were taking like 40 seconds to take a survey that took me 7 or 8 minutes to take. And so he set a mandatory minimum time for validating the survey response at 4 minutes. Some future actions here, again, for myself. I'd like to pursue grant funding. I got 0 grants for my initial project, but now I think I have a little bit more clout for my next round of grant applications. I have results. I have something that I can bring to the table. And I think that's going to be a little bit more promising in the future. I've done some very loose collaboration with Oregon State University's HDNR department. After I finished the analysis part of my project, I learned that they're doing a qualitative study on anglers' perceptions regarding fish hatcheries and hatchery fish. That's statewide. It's a 2-part survey, or sorry, a 2-part study, and it's really remarkable what they're doing. And there's a lot of similarities with our projects. We had a meeting a few weeks ago where the results of my survey was kind of helping them inform their methods and the way that they were asking their questions. And we're hoping for some potential operation for collaboration with both of our results in the future, hopefully with some publication. Speaking of that, I'd like to pursue publication, but likely after the next round of data, after the results are a little bit more cleaner and more robust, and more robust comparatives are possible. Now time for the warm and fuzzy part. There is a lot of surprises that I got out of this project. Number one, I like surveys with a question mark at the end on purpose. If you told me 1 year ago that I would actually really enjoy developing, administering, and analyzing surveys, I would call you crazy. If you say that I get excited about playing with data and working in SPSS, which is basically a glorified Excel, I would again call you crazy. But there really is a subtle and underappreciated art to developing survey questions to ask precisely what needs to be asked and precisely the correct way to answer your questions and achieve your objectives. I would not call myself an expert in that by any stretch of the imagination, but I have now grown to appreciate it and have much better understanding of what it's like. managing a project like this is really difficult. And I grew a ton from the experience. I have historically been one to kick the can down the road, so to speak. And I learned a lot about having to set timelines for myself to be successful. And I had a lot of guidance during the process. I was lucky enough to be working with Brett and Tara on developing surveys for a contracted project with CPW. And that really helped me to understand the care and effort that goes into administering and developing a survey. Next is a little bit more meta salmon conservation, things that I've really reflected on a lot. Is collaboration still even possible in the world of salmon conservation? I really hope so. But salmon conservation is a zero-sum game these days. The ideological divide between the two sides of the aisle is massive. The system is full of strife, it's full of conflict. I think it's definitely an optimistic dream, but it's still a dream of mine to find some way to bring people together to achieve that common goal of conserving salmon in perpetuity. It's just going to be a matter of finding a way to overcome the hurdle of the means that we take to get to that common goal. I think a really important part of that, and something that I have definitely challenged myself to do, is to embrace that messy complexity in the middle. To be effective at collaborating, we really have to avoid simplicity and that black and white ignorance of one side, other side. This is something that I've been reflecting a lot on after talking with the lead investigator on the OSU project, when I kind of caught myself in my own bias when he was telling us that one of the questions he asked is, do you feel that science supports your side of the argument on fish hatcheries? And both sides, whether they agreed with fish hatcheries or disagreed with fish hatcheries, said very strongly, yes, we do have science to support my side of the argument. So it's not just as simple as having science, it's about understanding each other. And I think that's really important to embrace. And lastly, I was hoping there'd be some current CLTL students here. It's just us old guys. But I put this one here at the end to say, if you are a current CLTL student, cherish it. This process goes by so fast. To be present and be mindful and don't take it for granted. And thank yous here. Thank you, Mark, Jennifer, Tracy, Kirk, Dana, Jay, Michelle, Tom, and especially Liz, who I work with the most from the Fish Society, for your support of my project and for the opportunity to collaborate on such an exciting initiative. Thank you, Brett and Tara, for your guidance with survey development, administration, and analysis. Thank you to Dawson upstairs. I'd said like he was gone. He's not. He's just upstairs. To my peers and to CLTL faculty for challenging me and inspiring me as much as you have. Thank you to my partner, Hannah, who's in attendance, to my friends and to my family, for all of you for your support. And I could not have done it without you. Here's my citations.